Welcome everybody to this Writing for Policy Impact free webinar offered to you by the On Think Tanks group. My name's Carolina Kern and I'll be leading the session today. A bit of housekeeping, boring but important. Can everybody hear me? And if you could use the chat box that you should be able to see floating either at the top or the bottom of your control panel to confirm this. I'm seeing a few people are saying yes, brilliant. Majority can hear me, I don't sound like a robot, we're already winning, fantastic. If for some reason the sound drops, which it has done in the past, do whiz a message across using the chat box. Either I'll be able to pick it up, even if the connection's a bit drops a bit, or my colleague Eva, who's on the line, will be able to send me a message to tell me that the sound isn't sounding quite right. Also use the chat box if you've got any questions or comments. So if anything comes to you while I'm speaking, pop it in the chat box. If it makes sense for me to answer it right away, I'll do that. If not, I'll leave it to the point at which we've stopped for discussion. I will keep everybody here muted, so you'll see a little line through your microphone for the duration discussion session, and the only reason for that is just to avoid background noise coming from your mics. So let's kick off. One final thing is that this session is being recorded, so for people who join late or who have to leave a tiny bit early, don't worry, it will be available and sent to you as a link tomorrow once we've uploaded it and done the editing that we need to do. So that's there for you to you when you need it. So let's kick off. Here's what I will cover today. There's three main things really that I'll go through. One is just quick. Did the connection drop already, Eva?
Yes, the connection just dropped, but you're back online.
Yes, but let me reshare my screen.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that, everybody. So three things I'll cover today. Why publications are so important. The bulk of the presentation, though, will be on top tips for writing more clearly, which I think is one of the main things that communications people or researchers can do to up the chances of any sort of policy impact. And the final thing is to make a bit of a pitch for the style guide and publication policies. That might sound a bit boring, but in my view, they're very important things to have within an organisation, not only to get you all speaking in one voice and in one sort of tone, but also they save a lot of time in the long run. And I won't go into that too much now because we'll get to that in a moment. There'll then be a chance for question and answers. And then we'll close. We've got a quick question. It's a really great question. Yes, the slides will come along as part of the recorded session, and the recorded session is actually a video, so you'll get the slides as part of that as well. But yes, you'll get the slide deck as a PDF'd version of the PowerPoint presentation. Now what I'm going to do, because I can see that my connection is dropping it says that it's a little bit unstable. I'm going to switch my video off for now, but then I'll come back on if I think that it's stable enough to do so. So let's focus on the slide deck for now. Right. So just to do a bit of a formal welcome, my name is Carolina Kern. I'm a strategic communications consultant based in Kenya. I've worked for a lot of different organisations, including donors, the private sector, NGOs. Most of my work, though, has been with UN agencies and think tanks. And the focus there has been largely on designing communication strategies and on providing sort of practical communication support for specific campaigns. I've also dabbled as an editor and a writer, and so I've got a lot of experience when it comes to sort of written content. I've been in Kenya for about 6 years, South Sudan before that, and in the UK working for the Overseas Development Institute for many years before that. I'm an associate of the On Think Tanks group, and I've been a trainer on their courses for quite a few years now. We've got a really diverse group of people online today, and those who have signed up as well, who have not joined us just yet. There's about 60 people signed up in total, spanning from sort of Australia to Zimbabwe and everywhere in between. So we've got a wonderfully diverse group of people online today. So thanks for joining. I know that it's very late or very early for a lot of people. And a warm welcome to you. So let's jump in though. This material, by the way, will take about 45 minutes to get through, sort of from about now. So you have a bit of an idea. That includes a bit of time for discussion at the end. So that's the sort of timings we're going to. So why do publications remain so popular? As you've no doubt noticed, communication techniques are changing. They've changed considerably in the last 2 decades. More organizations, be they think tanks or advocacy organizations or NGOs, are experimenting with a range of tools to get their messages out there, whether it's communicating policy, whether it's communicating research outcomes, or whether it's kind of fundraising and that kind of thing. And so the tools and channels at our disposal are growing massively, and think tanks in particular are using a real mix of those: events, podcasting, they're using their social media reach, they're using blogs, they're experimenting with the use of infographics. There's also a trend by some think tanks, particularly the big ones like Chatham House or IPPR, to move completely away from the hard copy publication. So they no longer print their reports in hard copy. They've moved away from that, and they've made digital a central plank of their communication strategy. This goes, of course, beyond just putting a PDF on your website, but they actually now upload every single page of content as in HTML format, so that it's easily searchable, and it's also designed to be very modular. And what I mean by that is that it means that every sentence or phrase or section or diagram or picture is shareable on across various platforms. But what does this mean for the publication? Is it dead? And the answer, I'm pleased to say, because I'm much more of an old school sort of communications person, in that I deal a lot more with written content and publications as such, is that it doesn't really mean that much. Because yes, the way that information is presented is changing, but the existence of a well-written, rigorously researched publication is what makes a lot of the other types of communication possible. Most of the most successful campaigns that I've worked on wouldn't have worked as well without a solid, chunky report with rigorously researched numbers and with a set of research findings. So the publication isn't dead. That's good news. In that sense, publications in all shapes and sizes still remain a very key part of the core business of think tanking. This is because, as I alluded to previously, they sort of contain the meat of your campaign, the thinking behind your thinking. Because as you build up your library, publications become sort of libraries of organisational knowledge. And that helps to build your credibility. And credibility is really important for research-focused organisations, especially in the days now of sort of fake news and even fake think tanks in some cases. So having a credible library of publications that is really important. And finally, publications remain key because they're very important branding tools in and of themselves. They're what you put your stamp on. So they're very important. And in fact, I would say that despite the fact that we've got loads of different ways of communicating ourselves these days, they're actually publications and written content more broadly is more important than ever before. Because of that, because we've got more information and more ways of consuming it. And in that sense, think tanks need to go back to basics and think through how to cut through the noise by communicating their arguments in as plainer English as they can, and trying to do that in multiple formats. And where possible, we should try and look at making our content as modular as possible so that different parts can be shared in different formats on different platforms. But all this being said, and all of this, the fact that publications aren't dead in the water is great, but writing is difficult. And it's not because spelling and grammar can be tricky. It's actually because you need to know what you're talking about before you put pen to paper. And when it comes to trying to have policy impact, you really need to have a clear and well-structured message for the particular audience that you're seeking to influence or interact with. Because unclear and confusing writing is essentially an accessibility barrier. It makes it more likely that the reader's either going to stop reading what you've written or fail to understand your key messages. And as mentioned before, publications are a very powerful branding tool. So be aware that sloppy writing in one report can have an impact on your organisation as a whole, not just on that report or that research area. I love this quote by the Pulitzer Prize winner, David McCullough, which kind of sums up what I just said. Writing is thinking, and to write well is to think clearly, and that's why it's so hard. It is a very difficult craft, and many people don't do it well. But the good thing is that there is hope, and there are tips and tricks that you can use to make your writing that bit clearer. And the On Think Tanks, the people who work for the On Think Tanks network, of which there are many, many staff, have worked and have been involved in drafting and editing and refining dozens of briefs and reports and working papers and annual reports and all sorts of written contents. And in doing this work, we've spotted several areas where people go a bit wrong. And we've worked these into 7 top tips for writing clearly. So I'm going to go through those now. Like I said, if you've got any, this is the bulk of the presentation. So if you've got any questions as I'm talking, please do feel free to use the chat box to ask them. So let's get going. The first top tip, which serves as a good top tip for life in general, is to get organised. What do I mean by that? When writing anything, be it a blog, a report, a policy brief, any of the sort of types of publications that research institutes tend to write, I always like to do 4 things. The first is to identify the purpose and overarching message of your piece. And this seems really silly, because why would you be sitting and having to do this if there wasn't a purpose? But the truth is that many publications are written because a donor has just asked that it be written. There may not be any strategic sense to producing a publication on that topic at that time. So sometimes you just have to do it because you've got you had the funding to do that and it's a deliverable, but sometimes there is scope to push back a little bit on donors and to kind of say, does it make sense to do something in this sort of format later or earlier than what you're asking? Or maybe your overarching message is far too complex because it's made up of too many big messages that should be broken down a bit, perhaps through several publications. So before you start and you jump into a publication, be quite tough on yourself and ask what the purpose of the publication is and what your overarching message is within that piece. So for a health-related piece of writing, for example, if you're writing if you're a health think tank and you're writing on a health issue, your overarching message may be to describe a gap between health status and health objectives. Or your overarching message might be to address a lack of consensus about solutions that have been put forth around a clearly identified problem. So the problem is clear to all stakeholders, but there's a lack of consensus about what to do. Or you may be calling attention to a new problem, and that might be the purpose and the message of your piece. Or you might be highlighting new knowledge in a particular area. So before you start tip-tapping away, make sure that number 1 is crossed off your list. The second thing to do is to outline the points that support your main message. Of course, this is much easier to do when you've done that initial first step, when you know you're very clear what your purpose is. So going back to the health example, if you were addressing a lack of consensus about a solution to a clearly defined problem, the way that your points might be constructed, it would be to state the problem, list the actors involved, what their views are and why they're aligned to each view, and then take a side. Explain why it's the best option and why urgent or targeted or joint action is needed. The third thing to do, and this is often where people get a bit lost, especially people who aren't very confident writers, is once you've got your purpose and you've outlined your key points, and you should be able to have no more than about 3 to 5 points that support your main message, is to construct a logical line of argument. What is she talking about? The term line of argument is kind of like the logical thread or the argumentative thread that leads your reader through a paper. And it ensures that the paper feels coherent. And your logical line or your argumentative thread must be apparent to the reader. They must start to feel it quite early in the publication, or they will get lost or confused or bored and then stop reading. Looking through sort of a couple of dozen policy briefs recently during a piece of work I was doing, I identified 4 main types of logical patterns that people tend to use to build up their argument, to build a line of argument. These are shown here. There's often an illustrative logical pattern. You may use cause and effect, which is quite common. You may choose to compare and contrast certain countries or policy areas, or you may take a more sort of process explanation or process definition. But the key thing is that these logical patterns are by no means mutually exclusive. You can use logical patterns in combination with each other to build up your argument. I'm not going to go into each of these in depth because we do that in the the longer writing course that we're running in October. But just to give you a flavour, this is the illustration pattern. This pattern gives concrete form to an idea through an example or illustration. And at its very basic, it just means giving an example. So you might state a general idea. So for example, here I've given the example of attacks against civilians by armed forces are intensifying in South Sudan. Your illustrative point that is building that argument is a sentence that would come right after that general idea is a fact. During 2013, X many separate incidents of physical or sexual abuse were recorded by Save the Children. This is more than the last 5 years combined. That's an example of an illustration logical pattern. In all, as you build up your argument and as you flow through your paper, in all arguments, logical connector words are key. And these are sort of transition words. And I've put some examples down at the bottom there. So your paper should be peppered with them, with these words throughout, to kind of guide your reader through what you're saying. So in summary, because it's quite a difficult set of ideas to get across, a clear main idea, you've got a main message in your paper, needs to lead to a specific line of argument in order to get that message across. A line of argument, or your argumentative thread, another way of putting it, requires a logical development using logical patterns, like the one that I highlighted here, the illustrative pattern. And logical connectors guide the reader through this development. Okay, so you've identified your purpose, you've outlined the points, you've constructed a logical line of argument, you've used a couple of logical patterns in order to build that argument. The thing to finish with, if you're looking to have any policy impact, is to end with an ask, or in other words, a set of recommendations. What do you want the person who's reading your publication to do? So that's top tip 1, get organised. Be very clear about what you're writing and why. The second tip is, again, seems like a silly one, but often isn't done by people when they're laying out their presentation, but it's to put the good stuff on top. And what I mean by that is to make sure that you devote or allocate a little bit of time to writing a good headline or a good title to your publication. Don't leave it to the end. Ensure you've got some decent subheadings that guide your reader's eye through the publication. Make sure you spend time on developing a great opening paragraph, especially if you're writing a blog, or developing great executive summaries if you're writing a policy brief or a report. These are often left to the end, and it's often when people are really tired of looking at their very long report that they've spent 2 years on. So in some cases, it can be useful to get somebody else completely to have a go at writing an executive summary. And as I said, to include in your writing recommendations, very direct recommendations that are actionable if possible, if you're able to go that extra step. What you shouldn't do is write long descriptions of your research methodology. And I know this doesn't sit very well with the researchers in the room, because many of them have been told that that's kind of, that's how, for example, academic journals are presented. You spend all your time writing about how you came to your research, and then next comes all the caveats and the reasons why your findings might not be what they seem, and then your recommendations come. For policy writing, long descriptions of research methodology should be stripped out. Similarly, providing unnecessary information about your program, your project, or the partnership that has brought this research to the page is not necessary. In general, the people that are reading this, the people who are looking for information that will help shape the policies that they produce, have not got very much interest in those. It mainly is something that you care about, not your external audiences. The third tip is that language matters. So use familiar words and avoid the passive voice. And we'll go through each of these 4 things one by one. I think that Orwell's rules here are a perfect summary of what I'm trying to say when I talk about the fact that language matters. And I've got a version of these printed out on my desk, and I often recommend people do the same. But the rules are, don't use a long word when a short one will do. If you can cut a word out, get it out. Never use a foreign phrase or a Latin phrase. That's very common for some researchers. A scientific word or a jargon word, if you think that an everyday English equivalent would be better. And don't use the passive where you can use the active. So here's a very, very quick example of what I mean by sort of cutting words that aren't necessary. You've got a sort of 16-word, I think, sentence here. The Overseas Development Institute has implemented a number of initiatives to boost its policy impact in Europe. An edit of this, which takes it down to, I think, 9 words or 10 words, is the Overseas Development Institute has taken steps to boost its policy impact in Europe. It says the same thing, but it says it succinctly. An example of what I mean by the use of familiar words. You can see a slightly exaggerated example here at the bottom. But in our line of work, in our sector, we use jargon a fair bit, and sometimes we don't even know that we're doing it. The only thing that jargon does is show that you're sort of part of a club. But if you want people outside of that club to understand your argument, if you want policy makers who are often generalists rather than subject matter specialists to understand what you're saying, strip that out and start thinking of your writing in terms of something that your grandma could understand, if possible. So use familiar words. And in that same vein, I would urge you to get rid of research speak, what I like to call research speak. Obviously, the participants here in this webinar are drawn from a very, very wide range of sectors, so this won't apply. These particular words won't apply, but I bet you have your own jargon within your sector. So things like accountable. We see this a lot, and this just feels like a normal word now, and that's fine if it in its rightful place. But at its core, we're talking about something or someone being responsible for or answerable to. When you talk about actors, what are you talking about? In most cases, you're not talking about sort of Leonardo DiCaprio, you're actually talking about other research agencies or donors or NGOs. So say that, spell it out for the person so that they don't make assumptions about what you're writing. In the aid industry, we use the word coping mechanisms a lot. What does that even mean? It's just ways of coping, ways of handling something. And I could go on and on, but I'm sure that in your research you can identify numerous words that you might have you might be using that could be made clearer, broken down. So strip out the research speak if possible. The third part of this sort of, I guess, this tip number 3, I think, which is around language, is that the passive voice should be avoided at all costs. The passive voice, and just a headline here, I'm not going to talk about grammar for ages in this presentation, so don't worry. The passive voice is when the action described by the verb, oh, and I apologize, there's a slight typo there, is performed on the subject rather than by the subject. In the active voice, which is what you should be using, the subject actively performs the action. And you can see here an example of what I mean. Sugarcane is raised by people in Hawaii is a passive version of that sentence. In the active, people raise sugarcane in Hawaii. The reason it's important, well, there are 3 kind of main reasons why it's important. A lot of people ask, well, why does it really matter? Why are you focusing on this? These sentences say the same thing. The first thing is that the passive voice weakens the action of the sentence, and it kind of just makes your writing less dynamic. It also sounds clumsy and less confident. And in our business of sort of creating new research and putting new policy solutions out there, confidence is key. It's also much less succinct. By using the active voice, you're making your sentences stronger, clearer, and your word. So going back to the example before, you've got an 8-word sentence. With the passive, with the active, you're able to say the same thing in 6. Now, the difference between 6 and 8 is sort of isn't much. But if your publication is riddled with passive voice, that can add and it's a long publication, it can add pages and pages to a long report. So use the active rather than the passive. And tools like the Hemingway editor, which is a free readability tool, which you can just Google, it's called the Hemingway editor, will help you to identify passive language in your writing. So if you're a bit unsure about what passive is and how to rewrite it, use that readability software to help you to rephrase sentences, and over time you'll get a lot better and a lot quicker at turning your prose into active rather than passive. The final thing in terms of on the language is try to avoid using gendered language by replacing words like man or mankind with people or humanity or men and women, and try not to associate men or women with certain professions. Try to use gender neutral terms. So, for example, substitute the word policeman with police officer, because unless the gender of that person is relevant, there's no real reason to gender a word. Tip number 4 of 7, and I'll speed up a little bit because I'm conscious of time, is to stick to the point. Think to yourself as you're going through and doing another edit of your publication or of your piece of writing, do you need this word? Is this paragraph restricted to just one idea? Remember that all paragraphs should have just one idea in them. And does this paragraph link to my key message? If it doesn't, does it really have a place in what you're writing? And note that by writing in the active voice, which we've just discussed, it helps you cut words out. It helps make your writing much more succinct. It helps you stick to the point a lot better. So stick to the point, cut the fat out of your writing. And there's some examples here of sentences that have been shortened to cut out 2, 3, 4 words. It makes a lot of difference in the end. It gets the reader to what you want to say quicker. Apologies. Another way to cut words is to remove the padding, to use shorter words. Instead of using as a consequence of, you just use because. With respect to, use for or about. And watch these phrases that pop up, and I see them a lot, where you've got 2 words that mean exactly the same thing. The sum total is just the total. It's just two words that have been positioned together that mean exactly the same thing. You do not need to include the word some. So try and go through some of your recent writing, or perhaps some of your reports that are already out there, and see where you could do that. The fifth thing, and this kind of I could be charged with sort of contradicting myself here slightly, is to tell the reader what you're going to tell them, and then tell them multiple times. Now, I'm not saying that you should be overly repetitive, but you should certainly tell them what your key message is at the beginning, and tell them again at the end. This sounds a bit like overkill, especially if you yourself, as the subject matter expert, understand the argument well. But for people who are generalists, who are new to the work that you're presenting, reminding them of what you're telling them is quite important. So this is an example here. I won't go through it in depth, but it's an IPPR, a very, very long IPPR report, where they're talking a little bit about the Brexit negotiations. They tell the reader, they remind them throughout the report what their key argument is. And they do it in slightly different ways, but it's the same sort of key message. Top tip number 6 is to make sure that you write for your target audience. This will influence how you're going to package your output. So remember to choose the format according to your target audience. So if you're going after policymakers, it might be more appropriate to develop a policy briefing or something of that in that vein. If you're trying to get academics on board in a sort of to encourage more collaboration, you might be wanting to develop a more to put out a more hefty report. Oftentimes your report is what you'll derive your policy brief from, of course. But just be conscious of writing for your target audience. And don't assume your reader's intelligence. Of course, you can assume some knowledge knowledge of the subject matter. But remember that they are not subject matter experts like yourself. Websites, for example, like BBC News, the BBC News website writes to a sort of 14 to 15 year old reading age. Now, you may be writing to a slightly older age, but just remember to not make your writing too complicated. It doesn't mean dumbing down. It means working harder to make sure that everyone can understand what you're saying. And again, if you use software like the Hemingway Readability, Hemingway editor, it will also give you a score on the readability of your writing. It will tell you whether your writing is hard to read and at what level it's been written. And finally, include recommendations. I've already talked about that briefly, but if you are seeking to change the world with your research, you need to have an ask. So that's the end of the top tips. I'm going to move on to style guides and publication policies, but I will just pause very briefly there in case there are any questions on the content that I've covered so far. Okay, nothing's coming up. There will be another space for questions and discussion at the end if you have any questions. So don't worry, this isn't your last chance. So style guides and publication policies. As I've I hope I've made the case, writing well is worth investing in, and it's worth spending time on. I find that developing a set of organisational style guides is a good start, as these help to document how these help to give you a standard of how different things that could be presented in the same sort of way, how you want your organisation to present them. It's not a matter of correct or incorrect grammar. These documents provide guidance for where many possibilities might exist. Style guides also allow, as I mentioned before, research centres to present their brand and their writing in a consistent way across publications and across channels. And I'll just give you an overview of both things. So a style guide, as you can see here, is something that helps you speak in one voice so that you're speaking in the same way across channels. Oftentimes within an organisation you've got multiple authors, so you want to try and keep them writing in one tone, and having a style guide gives you an instant answer where questions arise around the preferred way of doing things. So they provide guidance. What tends to be in them is a note on style, tone and audience. So is your organisation, are you striving for your organisation's voice to be sober? Is it urgent, direct? Oftentimes NGOs or advocacy organisations have a much more direct tone, for example, than think tanks. They've chosen to do that. That's the tone that they have chosen to go for. It also gives you your organisation's reference point. So, for example, what dictionary you're using as your main reference point. Are you using American English? Are you using the Oxford English Dictionary? It also provides a set of style points on how your editors, your comms people would like numbering, acronyms, punctuation, and hyphens to be done. And so ultimately, if these sorts of documents, these style guides are institutionalized, they actually do end up saving a lot of time, because people get used to a way of doing things. Your editor doesn't have to rework or rewrite sections. There's also, very importantly, a word list. A word list, I think, is one of the most useful things in a style guide. It's very context specific, so it's tailored to your particular organisation. Words that might come up over and over again. And it outlines words that tend to be spelt wrong or formatted incorrectly. So for the On Think Tanks group, we've got a word list that includes the word think tank, which some people hyphenate. We don't. That's an example of where you might use the way you might use a word list. Style guides will also tell you what to do. It's not necessarily a word list, but how capitalization works for commonly where capitalization is applied incorrectly, and provide examples. So you can see here, often people get a bit confused about whether to capitalize the word state, government, county, country. The state of Washington, the word state in that phrase is not capitalized. However, Washington state, which is a proper noun, is. So a style guide will include information about that. There may also be a set of house rules included as part of your as part of your style guide. What to capitalize, what not to. Here's an example from Virgin Media's style guides. It's more of a public sector, a private sector organization, and it gives you an idea of what I mean about tone and voice. This is what they seek to do in their written content. It also provides, style guides often provide information about how to write numbers correctly, which is something that is often mistakenly done. And the key thing about style guides, if you're developing one, if you're thinking of adapting one of the many ones that are out there, is to include examples, so that you're not relying on your researchers or your communications people to infer what you mean. So key takeaways on this: a good style guide should be about 10 pages. You may want a more in-depth one for your smaller communications team, but 10 pages in order for it to have any chance of being institutionalized. Remember that style guides are references, so they're not something that should be read from cover to cover. They're more of something that you consult. And make your style guide as accessible as possible. So put it on the intranet, include it in induction packs, make sure that staff are reminded of its existence over and over again. Publication policies, and I'm aware of time, so this will just be a kind of 1-minute blurb on publication policies, are not style guides. They're more a policy that describes the length, format, and audience for the different publications that your organization produces. They might specify the key sections that must be included in each publication. So if you produce policy briefs in your organization, your publication policy might state that that type of publication must have an executive summary and a set of recommendations, or it's not publishable in its current form. And they might outline or give examples of what these look like, these sections look like. They may also cover rules on authorship and the balance between senior and junior sort of researchers. What's in them? Things like minimum and maximum word limit per according to publication type, how headings and lists should be done, how chapters, figures, and tables should be presented, and what referencing style you might use. Again, these sorts of policies, if you take time to institutionalize them, save a lot of time, saves a lot of rewriting by your communications team, and just makes things a lot more streamlined. The thing that I would say, though, for both style guides and publication policies is not to, if you're thinking, yeah, I'm convinced, I want to develop one, is to not start with a blank piece of paper. There are many style guides that are publicly available and that you can adapt. The heavy hitters, the well-known ones, are listed here, but there are many online. If you just spend about 10 minutes Googling, you'll see. And these are the kinds of things that you can adapt for your specific context and add your specific word list, or provide, information for researchers that is specific to them and to their area. So that's the end of my slide deck. I have covered sort of 3 main things: why publications remain important, why written content is so crucial still, the top tips for helping you to write a little bit more clearly, and we've finished with boring but important stuff like the usefulness of things like publication policies and style guides to help organizations speak to one voice. I've seen a couple of questions come up, which is great. Let me just put us on the last slide, which is the very last slide, so that you can have a read of that. Let's take the questions one by one. Right. Could you comment on the effective use of metaphors for policy writing? Metaphors can work. What I would stay away from, and this is something that I've seen because of the fact that I've worked with organisations from different bits of the world, is that be careful with metaphors, because they can sometimes be quite context specific. You can often start using metaphors that don't work very well in other parts of the world. So I don't see any problem with using them, but just be aware of whether they're sort of easily recognized and known across a broad audience. Good saga out there that you can recommend? Yes. What I can do, Glenn, is I can send you a few if you'd be interested. I've got a few that's, in fact, the On Think Tank style guide is quite a good starter for 6 for you. So I can send that through to you. If I'm going to put my email in here. Sorry. Just double check that this is. Bear with me 1 second, just double checking that I'm giving you the correct email. I'll put my email in the chat box, and if you're interested in examples of good style guides, I'm happy to send a few kind of more think tank specific ones to you. Third question, can you give the links to some style guide? Yeah. Yes. So Diana, Glenn, if you can send me an email to remind me, and obviously to give me your details, I will send those to you. So anybody that wants a good style guide, I'm happy to provide a few that I've got. Obviously, these are shared in confidence and shouldn't be forwarded on. It's really just used by you internally as things that you can adapt. Hate acronyms. Catherine, sorry, I've not taken Lisa's question. I'll go back up to it. I absolutely hate acronyms. I think that if you can avoid them, you should. I'm sorry that I didn't mention them specifically in the tip around language, but I think that jargon and acronyms, particularly unspelt out acronyms, are just, yeah, they're just a way to be in a little club that only you and a couple of subject area specialists are a part of. If somebody has to Google an acronym that they find in your publications, it's already an accessibility barrier. It's like using an unfamiliar word. So yes, hate acronyms. Thanks for bringing it up. Really good point. How do you convince researchers to let go of their research speak? Yes, I know that's a difficult one, and it's one that I have struggled with at ODI. It's one that I know a lot of my colleagues within the On Think Tanks network struggle with. I think that there's a couple of things that you can do. There's my email, by the way, for those who are interested in style guides. There's a couple of things that you can do. One is to one thing that we did quite effectively at an organisation that I worked with was to show the difference between views of certain blogs that were written in plainer English versus ones that were written in sort of and riddled with research speak. I mean, that's a difficult thing to do, because it's, you know, it's a bit of an undertaking, and it's but it plays very much to a researcher's sensibility. It's a proper experiment. The other thing is to just point to the big, heavy-hitting think tanks. They are not writing in research speak anymore. They are working very, very hard not to dumb down their writing, and this is often what researchers try to argue. You know, I'm not dumbing down my stuff. It's actually to work harder to make complex arguments, difficult things to understand, more accessible to the common person. So one of the ways that I convince, that I use to try and convince researchers to write a bit more clearly is to look at those think tanks that are getting or grabbing more policy impact. They're the ones that are writing clearly. They're the ones that are writing punchy recommendations, that are being cheeky about what they're asking people to do, and are being specific about how they're asking them to do it. I hope that helps a little bit, but it's not an easy thing to do, particularly for researchers that have come from the sort of hard sciences. They've effectively been taught how to write in that way, and it's very difficult for them to let that go, to not write and include lots of caveats in their work, to not write in the passive voice, but I think showing them what other sort of successful institutions are doing can be quite helpful. Any good style guide? Yeah, so I've got a lot of questions coming in about good style guides. Yeah, I mean, have a look at the one that I've put on this slide deck, the Chicago style guide, the Guardian style guide. That's kind of more of a word list, a very, very expansive word list, but they're really interesting to have a look at. And I've used bits and pieces of those to develop different style guides for clients before. But if you take my email and email me, I'll attach some style guides that are worth looking at. The only thing I would say is obviously, as I said just now, don't share them, just use them and adapt them in whatever way you can. You'll note though that some of these style guides don't follow my rule of being 10 pages long. Some of them are much, much longer. But my thinking is that for you to get researchers to sort of keep going back to them, you don't want to present them with a massive book. You want to kind of go in easy. So provide them with the core stuff you want them to take away, and maybe have a bigger style guide for your communications team. View on acronyms. Are there any instances where organizations have developed style guides based on staff feedback? Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say, and this might have, because I was wanting to finish sort of semi on time, is style guides should be sort of live documents. You shouldn't sort of finish your style guide and that's it. It's never going to be changed. I think it is useful to ask for feedback on those those guides, but I think that in order for you to get anywhere and to end up with a style guide, it should probably be led by your head of comms or by somebody senior within your organization. I don't think it can be done entirely via staff feedback. Yes, Lisa, yeah, that's right, on acronyms, I believe. Oh no, how do you convince researchers to let go of their research? Yeah, you could add a sort of a case in the style guide itself. And finally, the last writing, do you have a preference for writing out numbers 1 to 10 in words, 11 and up in numbers, or 1 to 100? Yeah, so that's a very specific thing. Grammatically, the only numbers that should be written out are 1 to 9. From 10 onwards, they should be in numerals. And that's kind of quite a hard grammar rule, but it may differ in some contexts, so I don't want to make it too hard of a rule. But yeah, that's, in my experience, 1 to 9 is written out, 10 and over is done in digits. So there's no more questions that I can see coming in, and we're just over the hour, because we've had such a lovely load of questions come in. What I would encourage you to do, if you're interested, is to sign up for our more comprehensive writing course. This is this includes 2 60-minute sessions. It's £75 plus £30 if you want personalised feedback on a writing task. I've lost my presentation. There you go. The sessions are great. They cover 2 very common publication or content types. One is a policy brief, how to develop one, taking you through step by step the different sections, how to develop good recommendations, how to we dive a lot more deeply into logical lines of argument, which I know are a difficult thing to get your head around. And then the second session is on blogging, and look how writing for the web is a bit different to writing publications. It looks like it talks about how to use particular techniques to draw your reader's eye to certain bits of your publication to help highlight your key messages. And it gives you an overview of the different formats of blogs that research institutes are using to help get their research across. There's not just one type of or one format of blogging that you can use. So if you're interested, please sign up over the course of the next month. I think that the first session is on or around the 2nd of October. And then there's another one the following week. It's only £75, very, very, probably quite easy for you to get approvals to take this course, and it's packed with specific tips on writing specific publications that are quite common within think tanks and research institutes. So webinar 1 on policy briefs, webinar 2 on blogging. And that's my pitch for the writing course next month. Thank you very much for joining. I'm sorry that we've run slightly over time, but we had quite a lot of questions. Do email me if you're interested in receiving information about the course, or if you'd like some sample style guides to look at. Thank you very much for joining.